All right, welcome everyone to one of our back to school webinars. This one's focused on the shift from learning loss to youth-centered learning. This is part of our back to school webinar series, which I know some of you are familiar with because I recognize you from others. But the next one's coming up later today is the STEM in the Club training. That's for folks that are facilitating STEM. Project Learn overview coming up on Monday if Project Learn is something that you're interested in implementing this year. And then one that I'm super excited about coming up on Tuesday is Innovative STEM Programming. We're going to be featuring 4 club staff that submitted ideas and wanted to share with the movement some of the great things that they're doing in STEM. And there are others, but these are the next ones coming up that I wanted to mention. Also, a few back to school tools that I want to make sure everyone knows about. These are all on programbasicsplanner.com/back. And we'll talk more about these because they're very connected to today's topic. But brand new school partnership tools, including a planning guide, some tools and templates, resources you can use to establish or strengthen a partnership with local schools. New family and caregiver engagement tools, because that's one thing that COVID really brought to the forefront, that it's pretty difficult to do education without strong family and caregiver engagement. So I'm really excited about those new tools. And then that's also the website from which you can book a one-on-one consult with a YD staff member at whatever date and time works best for you. So I want to make sure everyone knows about those. And then let's dive in. So looking back on the past, it's been a year and a half now. I would love to spend a little bit of time thinking about some of the ways that your club has responded to young people during COVID-19, particularly when it comes to learning. How have you been responsive and offered learning opportunities that fit the current context? And if anyone's willing to share, we'd love to hear from you, or if you just want to reflect on what your club's been doing, that's fine as well. But anyone have any examples of how your club has risen to the occasion, responded to the current moment when it comes to supporting learning?
Are you talking about like right now in the summer or like throughout the last year?
Any summer or throughout during the whole period of COVID-19.
Oh, okay. Well, I would say, so for us, just, being open all day, I think our hours changed from like 7 a.m. to 8 p.m. So we were serving as like a remote learning site, trying to train staff on how to support, teachers to do the online learning while still doing Boys and Girls Club programming. So like during the year, that's sort of what we did. And then for summer camp, the past few years, we have tried to integrate education more into our summer camp. So we're like, education and recreation. And then this summer, we hired 3 teachers to teach at our summer camp in ELA and math. And we did like a staff training on how to do educational programming. So like every group is getting, STEM and like spelling and reading and grammar, all that kind of stuff. So that's what we're trying to do. And, trying to figure out how much we can go without losing who we are as the Boys and Girls Club.
Yeah, thanks for sharing, Adam. That all sounds great. Anyone else, anything else you've been doing to be responsive to the moment over the last year and a half?
Just like Adam said, during the school year, we did, well, before the closing of everything, we opened up the virtual portal like I know everybody kind of did, and we just took it also a step further, also still doing the homework help, maybe having some pop-up visits, still trying to just encourage the youth, as well as hosting the site for them to come for a few hours, do a little virtual learning, give them a snack, and then have them go back home, as well as summer brain game for the summertime, as well as using some of those like DIY STEM and things like that we have just to help them and just give them a little boost. Also, we've had 1 or 2 outsourced resources come. We had a science guy come and, do a couple of experiments with the kids each week, to also kind of like boost morale and also do, like I said, some more STEM theme. Didn't have a teacher come on, but we did the best we could with what we had. I'm sure like everybody else did, but just the little things that we can.
Yeah, that all sounds great. Thanks for sharing that, Willie. So yes, just wanted to take a moment to reflect. So much of the conversation about the impact of COVID-19 on learning is about all the challenges that are presented, which are very real and serious. But I also just want to remember that clubs are doing incredible work and you all are doing incredible work in the midst of this. And that's certainly something to celebrate. So the topic for today is from learning loss to youth-centered learning. If you have consumed any media, read any articles, listened to any podcasts, watched any news, this topic of learning loss is pretty pervasive. It comes from the idea that when young people were moved out of school, were shifted out of school for the pandemic, that researchers started extrapolating based on what tends to happen during the summer, which is that when young people are out of school for the summer, they tend to regress in some of their math and reading skills, so that when they start the following school year, they need to do a little bit of catching up. You can't assume that a young person is starting in the fall in exactly the same place where they were the previous spring. So this conversation about learning loss and the fear of COVID learning loss has been all over the news. And so I want to ask for a moment, and you can share aloud or in the chat, however you feel comfortable. What do you find helpful about this term? And what is potentially problematic about the term? You can answer either question or both questions. Clearly identifies the problem. Yeah, that's something that's been really helpful is this helped people talk about education in a way that education hadn't been necessarily in the public conversation before. And yeah, problematic is it's not strength-based learning. One of the things that is tough about learning loss is it kind of sounds like it's blaming students for losing learning. Obviously, it was no student's fault that a global pandemic kept them out of school for 1.5 years or for some stretch of time. Any other thoughts on what's helpful about this term and what's potentially problematic about it?
I would like to add about the learning loss. So when I hear the word learning loss, I just think that it's not really like the best term, because you just had all these kids learn how to learn during the pandemic and experience the pandemic and cope with it. And maybe they learned new skills or techniques or something. There's like a lot of learning that did happen in that time. Just had to learn differently.
Absolutely. So the term learning loss kind of assumes that what young people need to be learning is the exact curriculum that was maybe on their syllabus in a typical school year, and doesn't acknowledge all of the things that young people did learn over the last 1.5 years that they might not have, especially if they spent a lot more time with family or they spent a lot more time in different community contexts than they would have before. So some people instead will say, academic learning loss to acknowledge that there are different types of learning, or we'll talk some about messaging later about how do you describe the phenomenon without making it sound like young people didn't learn anything for 1.5 years, since that's not the case. Any other thoughts you want to share? I'll mention one other that comes up sometimes, is that if we use sort of the trends on learning loss and test scores and who's going to do well on test scores when they're back in school versus who's going to have lower scores, all of that is about the young people that are in school and might be missing out on the many young people and families who have been disconnected from schools and community organizations over the last 1.5 years. One of the big problems that school districts are facing right now in this back to school season is trying to reconnect and re-engage with families that may have moved away, with students who, because of the circumstances of COVID, no longer have the same contact information or are no longer in the same district. So we want to both care for the young people that are in the room and who are showing up for school, and not forget the young people who aren't in the room and who may need to be re-engaged. And yes, thanks for adding this, Adam. This is a very fundable problem. It's the type of thing that a lot of potential funders want to talk more about is what are we going to do about learning loss? Because it feels like a very clear from to, here's the problem, what's the solution? So we are going to talk more about messaging and how you can describe the situation, acknowledge the reality of the challenges of COVID, and acknowledge the reality of the impact of COVID-19 on academic success, but in a way that's strength-based and in a way that speaks well of young people and the work that they're doing and the learning that they're doing. So we'll get into messaging. But first, I want to say to the question of what are we going to do about learning loss, Boys and Girls Clubs of America has said our response to the threat of learning loss is youth-centered learning. That's what we're going to do about it. And so let's talk about what that is. If you haven't heard of youth-centered learning, it's an overall approach to teaching and learning in which young people with their strengths, needs, interests, and identities are at the center. And then flexible learning opportunities and supports are designed to respond to their unique experiences and to who they are and what they need. So that's why I wanted to start by asking, what has your club done to be responsive? Because in many cases, your club may be offering youth-centered learning, even if you haven't been calling it that. And if that's the case, I would say this is an opportunity to be more intentional, to look at the things that you're already doing to be responsive and look for opportunities to further respond to where young people are and what might benefit them right now. So youth-centered learning, youth-centered approach, it has a couple of key components. And the first one, and maybe the foundation, most important one, is leading with connection and prioritizing social and emotional wellness. We know that the last year and a half has been a tough year for a lot of young people. A lot of young people have experienced trauma, whether they lost someone because of COVID-19 or someone they loved was sick or lost a job, or the multitude of other challenges that they may have encountered over the last year and a half could include trauma. And so welcoming young people back, encountering them with emotional support is really key. It's very difficult to jump right into academic programming without first meeting young people where they are emotionally. Second is a spectrum of enrichment and support. And in their examples, both Adam and Willie mentioned this. That spectrum of enrichment and support includes some of the sort of academic remediation of how do we help young people build some foundational skills that maybe they didn't build in a virtual learning setting the way they might have in person, while still offering those enrichment experiences that invite young people to fall in love with learning, to discover something new, to try something they might not have learned before. And the reason that this is key to the youth-centered learning strategy is that a lot of the conversations about learning loss have said the problem is learning loss, the answer is remediation. We're going to do more math worksheets, more homework, more academic drills to kind of catch up. And I would say that that's not the solution that we want to aim for, because so many clubs really thrive in the enrichment space. And inviting young people to fall in love with learning and to connect with their passions is probably going to get more mileage than just more remediation. But that support, that homework help and tutoring is still really critical, especially now. So full spectrum there. Third, relevant, responsive, high-yield learning activities. High-yield learning activities are the teachable moments, the opportunities to fall in love with learning, the aha moments. And so an effort to make those relevant to young people so that if the question comes up of why are we learning this, you have an answer, and responsive to who they are and what they need, so that it doesn't feel totally disconnected from what they're thinking about and experiencing every day.
Christy, can I just throw something in there? Just to, maybe you'll talk about this
Please.
later. One of the things I thought that was interesting that you said, and I agree in theory with the idea of like the club is a place to support a love of learning. But one of the things I've run into, I guess on the limitation side of that is the actual skill building. So like the example I'll give is we have an internship program where we get a lot of our juniors or seniors in high school into these higher level internships as far as requirements. And then they're with their peers from, say, a suburban school district, a wealthier school district. And the feedback we're getting are, we would love to work with this young person, but their math skills are not there. Their writing skills are not there. And I think that puts it back on us, and we start to think, okay, do we start providing writing, skills and math skills at the club? And I think that's the hard part, because the feedback we're getting from employers is, we would love to work with your kids, but you got to help them catch up.
Yeah, no, that's perfect. And so the exact feedback that you're getting is also what the research is saying are two of the biggest areas of need. So math skills and writing skills. What tends to happen is that young people from wealthier communities who have access to more enrichment, when school's out, they tend to keep excelling in reading skills. And young people that don't have access to that enrichment tend to see a drop off in reading skills. And for math, it's a little more like everyone struggles with math when they're not in school. So math skills and reading skills, absolutely really important. And so if I were thinking about that full spectrum of enrichment and support for math and reading, I would say some of the homework help and tutoring or schoolwork help, if you're open during the day and operating all the time. There are some specific resources in Power Hour for math skills and reading skills. They're all aligned to the Common Core. So that if you're able to identify, for instance, like these young people are having a really hard time with math equations that have two variables, you could pull that activity and say, we're going to do the math equations with two variables activity. Or we have a lot of young people that are struggling to add fractions. So we're going to pull this adding fractions activity and do it. Similarly for literacy, there are those Common Core aligned skills. So that would fall sort of on the support side of the spectrum. That's more like remediation of identifying gaps and helping build those skills. And then on the enrichment side, most of our enrichment in math is integrated into STEM. So like if you're doing DIY STEM, for instance, math skills are kind of folded in there. There's also a lot of math and computer science. And in literacy, I would say Summer Brain Gain Read is kind of our enrichment literacy program for all ages. So those Summer Brain Gain is always going to be week-based modules, but the read modules are based around a book, and it specifically includes literacy skills that are developmentally appropriate. For teens, though, I think the reading and writing enrichment that I might recommend is Lyricism 101. Which is about hip hop, the art of the cipher, songwriting. So you would pitch it to teens as a lyricism and songwriting program, but it's really a literacy program. Those are the skills that it's designed to help build. Or you may have really great locally developed programs that you can just be thinking about. How do we make sure that young people are still building those math and literacy skills, but in a way that feels fun and relevant? Instead of only doing the academic support Power Hour, let's help practice this skill, if that helps at all. Thanks for adding that in. That's certainly a real problem, is how do you balance the academic support with the enrichment piece? The next two categories here, 4 and 5, both have to do with building a young person's ecosystem of support. So we know that young people learn throughout the day, and that full continuum of care from when they wake up in the morning and they're at home with family and caregivers, to time at school, to time in the club, all of that matters. And clubs can have a deeper impact when they're part of the connective tissue and they're part of the partnerships. So family and caregiver engagement and school partnership are the next two pieces here. And then finally is youth advocacy. I would say this is kind of the pinnacle of youth-centered learning. If you are really doing youth-centered learning to the max, then you're probably supporting opportunities for young people to identify things they care about and then dive in. So whatever the whatever the topic is or whatever they're committed to, when the club is supporting them to pursue that passion and keep learning more about it, and even amplifying their voices, that would be a really strong example of youth-centered learning. And so I sort of spoke to this, but just to kind of lay it out, these things kind of gradually increase from a foundational level where leading with connection is really essential. That spectrum of enrichment and support and responsive, culturally relevant programming is a next level up. Then sort of the partnership category of how are you partnering well with caregivers and with schools. And then youth advocacy is kind of the pinnacle of this experience. If you wanted to do a quick gut check and say, to what extent is our club offering youth-centered learning right now? This is what youth-centered learning might sound like. So if you had young people saying, at my club, I get to learn more about the things I care about. I get help with the things that are hard for me. So knowing that staff are responding, that they know what's hard for you and they're helping you intentionally. My friends and staff know what I'm good at and they're challenging me to learn and grow. Staff are always asking me questions and then making decisions based on my answers. So knowing that your voice matters. Or this last one speaks to the partnership piece. I'm in a community that supports me and my club or youth center is part of that community. Those would be some indicators that what you're offering is youth-centered learning. I want to mention a couple of examples, and this is a small number compared to a multitude, but just a couple of examples of stories that have kind of been shared with my team of things that clubs are doing that maybe highlight each of these components of youth-centered learning. I'll start at the bottom since we're kind of going from foundational to more advanced. So if Boys and Girls Clubs of Garden Grove is one that has really intentionally been focused on trauma-informed practice, emotional wellness, and checking in with people emotionally, including youth, staff, and families and caregivers. On this spectrum of enrichment and support, I think so many of you are doing this, but offering that distance learning, that pandemic pod, the learning support center during the day, along with some enrichment that's focused on topics that young people want to learn more about. On the whole, during the school year, over 1,000 clubs were operating as learning support centers, which is incredible that that's been such a tremendous response from the movement. There are so many fun examples of culturally relevant high-yield learning activities. One that I think is really interesting that's very local is in Baltimore, where dirt bikes are a big thing. There's a program that uses dirt bike culture to teach STEM, to disrupt the prison pipeline, to build bridges in communities. They do career exploration and workforce readiness. So that's just one example of a program that's very responsive to local interests and to the community it's in. There are tons of great examples of clubs that are doing family and caregiver engagement, and you can find some of those in the new Family and Caregiver Engagement Guide. But Boys and Girls Clubs of Fox Valley, for instance, was offering behavioral and mental health supports, case management, mentoring, programming in connection with schools that were identified as high need schools. In the school partnership space, the Arizona Alliance is one that had sort of a statewide effort. A lot of clubs are partnering with schools on the district level, but this is one where the whole alliance partnered with the state. We're able to get federal funds to operate learning support centers and to support virtual school. And then one example of a club that's doing youth advocacy work was the Boys and Girls Clubs of Greater Houston. Had a virtual teen town hall, and if you want to watch it as an example, it's on My Future on the events page. And they announced a teen-run social justice initiative called Be the Change You Want to See. So those are just a few promising practices of many, and I would welcome you if you've got others that you want to highlight or shout out from your own organization or other organizations you're aware of. Please share them. You're welcome to share them out loud or in the chat if anyone has some they want to mention. the door is still open. So if you want to share, feel free to toss it in the chat or speak up, and I'll yield the floor. I did want to get back to this messaging point for just a minute and ask, what would it sound like to shift the way we talk about COVID-19's impact on education from the learning loss narrative to a focus on youth-centered learning? And if you're someone who is kind of like, oh, this is nuance, this is words, I'm not sure this matters. I love when we went through the strength-based language training, one of the ways that they started that session is to say, actions speak louder than words, absolutely, but words still matter. And the way that we talk about young people matters, especially if it's either building them up or it's blaming them for something, or it's blaming their families for something that shouldn't be phrased that way. So I'll give you just a few examples. So on the left, one common phrase that shows up everywhere is, because of COVID learning loss, youth are about a year behind. A way that you could phrase that, either when you're talking to your stakeholders, talking to potential funders, talking with community organizations that want to know what your club is doing, that might be a little bit more accurate, is to say that researchers are predicting that many students will not master the same academic content they would in a typical school year, and to acknowledge that some young people really thrived in a virtual setting. For some youth this year, and the differences in education were great, while others didn't have access to effective academic supports throughout the school year. So that acknowledges the reality that a lot of young people didn't have access to the support they needed, without just saying blanket statement, everyone's a year behind. Similarly, instead of the kind of chorus that students missed out on a full year of learning, a more youth-centered approach would be to say, young people have missed out on a typical academic experience, including the academic support, the social and emotional connections with peers and adults, and the wraparound services like meals and therapy that school provides. This acknowledges that when we're responding to the impact of COVID, it's not just all about math scores and reading scores, but it's also really important to acknowledge that young people rely on school for other things, like an opportunity to connect with friends, an opportunity to connect with mentors. Meals were huge. I know so many clubs, and maybe your own as well, were serving meals as part of your COVID response as well. And then providing therapy. That's particularly true for young people that have an individualized education plan or a 504 plan because of some special need. Having access to therapy and support is really important. And then last one here, if the thing that we've seen a lot is to reverse learning loss, we need to double down on remediation so youth can catch up on all the skills they missed. A more youth-centered approach might be to say, we're going to offer a full spectrum of enrichment and support. We are going to offer that homework help and tutoring to help build up some of those skills. And we're going to continue to offer enrichment to help young people explore new things and connect to their passions. So I want to shift us to implementation a bit and talk about what kind of resources are available to implement youth-centered learning and to implement various aspects of this approach. The overarching one, before we get into the details of the different components, is that in order to be youth-centered, you have to know who your young people are and what they care about and what their strengths are and what they need. It's very hard to be responsive if you don't know who or what you're responding to. And so a great first step for youth-centered learning would be to talk to young people, to talk to their families, to talk to the school, to gather whatever kind of data you can about where young people are and what kind of support they need. That's going to have to be developmentally appropriate. Some of your older youth might have a better job of saying, for instance, you know, last year I had a really hard time with math and science, and so I could use some extra help with math and science. For your younger youth, it might be more helpful to ask their families about some of the academic stuff, but to still ask young people, how do you feel this year? How are you feeling if they're going back to school in person? How are you feeling about that? What can the club do that would help you right now? So the first implementation piece of being youth-centered is to talk to youth, to talk to their families, to talk to people that know them well and gather that data. That data can also come from surveys or focus groups. If you've never seen the Pulse Checks toolkit that Boys and Girls Clubs has published, that just gives you lots of quick ways to get information from young people so that you're not just sitting down and doing a giant survey for an hour, but you're asking young people to give you little bits of information in a fun way. To dive into the different components of youth-centered learning and some of the resources that support implementation, I'll start down at the bottom again. When it comes to leading with connection, emotional check-ins are a great way to lead with connection. Every Boys and Girls Clubs of America program is each activity starts with an emotional check-in, but even if you're running a program that you've created or that you found from somewhere else, you can just be intentional about asking young people to check in at the beginning of the day or at the beginning of the session and share how they're feeling. A very important part of that, though, is that if a young person shares something that's concerning, you have to follow up. So you wouldn't want to do an emotional check-in and ask people, for instance, if your mood were the weather, what would the weather be and why? And a young person says, my mood would be a tornado because I'm feeling terrified and everything is falling apart. And then you just say like, all right, well, let's start baking cookies. So a critical part of emotional check-ins is responding, particularly when someone shares something that's concerning. Some other good tools for emotional check-ins, the behavior support toolkit is fairly new. It's designed to be trauma-informed. A lot of it is focused on behavior support. So how you can kind of operate with the assumption that all behavior is communication, that when young people are behaving in different ways, they're trying to communicate something, and you can be responsive to that. It also is going to include links to the Smart Moves emotional wellness content. So that's new, and it's full of emotional wellness support. So if you wanted to pick one program that you could do related to emotional wellness and connection, Smart Moves Emotional Wellness would be a good choice. If you're thinking specifically about teens, there's also a new teen mental health discussion guide, because as you probably know, that's one of the things when teens are asked right now what their top concerns are, a lot of teens are expressing concerns about their own mental health or the mental health of their peers. So that's a pressing issue for teens in particular. In the spectrum of enrichment and support category, I mentioned Power Hour. The way you can find those Common Core aligned activity guides is on the Power Hour page on bgca.net. If you go to the program documents section and search for activity books, you'll get all of them. They're split up in math and reading, and they're split up by age group. So depending on the age group you're working with, you can pull those and then identify the specific skills you want to help build. Summer Brain Gain is also a way that you can look at offering some project-based learning, but very connected to literacy and math skills. In particular, the STEM modules in Summer Brain Gain are going to integrate math skills. The READ modules are going to integrate literacy skills. And then at this point, I think everyone's figured this out by now, but if you're still trying to work through potentially operating a learning support center where you're helping young people, not with club programming, but with schoolwork that they're bringing from school, or if they're still in virtual school, the Practical Guide to Learning Support Centers is there for that. In the responsive, relevant, high-yield learning activities, if you haven't heard of My Future, that's a quick space where you can find some high-yield learning activities, myfuture.net. There are always great ideas on the Club Experience blog. So if you don't follow that, it's where you can get relevant ideas. A lot of times it's if there's a holiday or an event coming up, it's very like real-time relevant. BGCA.net obviously is where all of the program materials are. And if you wanted a quick reference just to what are the academic success programs or what are all the education programs, then that's a bit.ly link / academic success overview. The A, the S, and the O are all capital because it is case sensitive. And I'll send that out as a follow-up as well. But that's a quick reference for what are all of the programs that support academic success. Very excited about these new family engagement tools. These were just recently published and they're really great. You can find them on the Program Basics Planner in the Family Caregiver section. It's very principle driven, but with specific ways you can apply those principles with promising practices from clubs and some tools and templates that make it easy to get started or to keep building on what you've already got. Similarly with school partnerships, the place to start is the School Partnerships Planning Guide. But then all of the other tools and templates, kind of choose the ones that make sense for you. So if you're looking for a template for how to set up transportation from the school to the club, there's one for that. If you're looking for a template for how to do a data sharing agreement with the school, there's one for that. And I think to the earlier question about like, if you really want to focus on building academic skills, probably the best way to do that is with a strong school partnership. Because you don't want to be administering standardized tests in your club. You don't want to say, all right, everybody sit down, we're going to take the state math test together. But youth are already doing that in school. And so if you set up a strong data sharing agreement with local schools, then you can let schools do what they're already doing, but have a way to share that data in a way that's in compliance with FERPA, which is like the HIPAA is to healthcare as FERPA is to education. It's protecting young people's privacy. So a data sharing agreement allows you to be really targeted and really responsive to where young people are, what skills they're strong in, and what skills they need some more support with. And then finally, up in the youth advocacy space, Keystone and Torch Club both include some resources that you could use to get young people together and ask them to identify something they really care about and then make a plan for how they want to respond. So that's really project-based learning, which is a great way to learn new skills, but in a way that's wrapped around something that youth really care about. So let me pause for a moment and ask, what questions do you have so far about youth-centered learning, about any of the resources supporting implementation or any of these specific components?
Maybe I'll just throw out there, the one thing that I think is next steps, at least, for my club, is just staff training around this. I think half of the staff that we have that I work with are excited to do this kind of stuff. The other half are a little bit nervous about education. And maybe it's as time goes on, the numbers reduced. There used to be like a lot of pushback, like we don't do academics in the club, like it's supposed to be fun, school's not fun. That's like lessening. And I think people are, part of that was a fear of like feeling like they couldn't lead these kind of activities. But would you point to any resources or offer suggestions for how to make sure staff feel trained to promote learning at the club?
Yeah, definitely. So let me start by saying one way to do it would be to say, let's give all of our staff training in all of these different components. Like we want everyone to understand how to do academic support and enrichment. We want everyone to understand how to do family engagement, everyone to understand how to do school partnerships. Or you could kind of do a little bit of roles and responsibilities of who's going to do what so that people have an area of focus. Because maybe there's one person in your club who can really start on leading the family engagement effort or leading the school partnership effort, and then they can bring people along. Whereas when it comes to facilitating programming activities and making sure that you're supporting learning as a tutor or as a program facilitator, maybe that's the type of training that you want everyone to have. The easiest way to see all of the trainings that I would recommend is in the education learning pathway. And I will put a direct link to that. Actually, it's going to be on the last slide. So I'll share a direct link to the education learning pathway. And basically what that is it's a list of the trainings that the education team recommends, starting with some foundational stuff. So active learning is a great training. If your staff haven't done active learning, that's a great place to start. And it talks about the basic idea of, in order to support active learning, you need great content and you need adult support. So how do you choose the right content for youth, and how do you support youth well? If you're thinking specifically about homework help and tutoring, we've got a homework help training that just focuses on how do you sit down with a young person and help them through work that you didn't design for them, that a teacher assigned them, but you want to support them. So there are foundational trainings kind of at the 101 level, like active learning and homework help. One level up, you kind of get into the strategy, and that's going to have things like hands-on learning. How do you facilitate that active hands-on learning? STEM in the club is one of our 201 level trainings. How do you facilitate STEM specifically? So those are going to be more strategy-based. Project Learn is also a great 201 level training. And then the last level, 301, is specific to individual programs. So there's a training for Power Hour, for Ultimate Journey, for Summer Brain Game. So those would be more specific if you know a staff member is going to be running a given program. Training specific to literacy for K through 3. Let me send you, so we don't currently have a K through 3 literacy training for Boys and Girls Clubs, but there is a great one that one of our partners just put out, and it is from Cox campus. And I will actually put the link in the chat right now. And while I'm doing that, any other questions that anyone wants to ask? All right, that link should be in there. Cox is one of our partners that supports academic success, and Cox campus has lots of great trainings, but particularly for younger youth, and literacy is one of their focus areas. What other questions do you have about youth-centered learning?
All right, no one's gonna ask a question. I'm gonna ask another one. A couple of years ago, I had gone to a BGCA conference, and the Boys and Girls Clubs of the Peninsula, their CEO spoke about how it felt like what they did essentially is like blew up like their model and decided we're gonna align with schools. And our focus is gonna be making sure that young people are progressing through their grades, meeting like school benchmarks and graduating from high school, going to college, then graduating from college. And they had a very strategic and intentional alignment with education. Do you think that's a good strategy? Like, does that go too far? I mean, I know I'm asking for your opinion a little bit, but I think it was very interesting to learn what they did. And it seems, at least from what I've learned from them, is that they have moved the needle more than if you're just doing enrichment activities. Like, it seems like they've had better academic outcomes.
Yeah, that's great. And I can't speak to all of the details of their approach, but I hear great things about their organization all the time. I would say, in the question of, is it the right move to do a really intentional focus on education? I think it's great if you can do it well. The one thing I would caution is that if you decided to dive all in on academic support and remediation, but did it in a way that wasn't fully supportive of youth and thought out, I've heard people sort of give the principle of, like, in medicine, that you first above all do no harm, that a homework help program that's not run well can actually be a negative impact instead of a positive impact. Similarly with like a tutoring program that's not well supported, and that youth aren't enjoying, or they're not feeling like they get the support they need, could be more frustrating. And so Yeah, true, with math homework help as well. So I know that's not a super applicable recommendation of like, if you're going to do it well. So maybe the better way to say it is to under promise and over deliver. To start with something that you know your club can be really successful with, and then think about scaling up, so that you're not trying to do a full court press on academics and then realize like, oh, it's not really working. Our staff weren't quite ready for this, or our youth aren't enjoying this the way we thought they would. And then the other thing I would say about that alignment with the schools and that focus on academic success is to let schools do what they do well. Clubs don't need to replicate the school environment, and I think testing is the best example of that. Schools are already doing testing, so we don't need to hop into that lane. We can just set up a data sharing agreement and ask for that information to be shared. Similarly, with something that schools are already doing is working with young people with special needs and identifying what belongs on an individualized education plan. So a strong partnership where you're working with the right people at the school to say, how can we better support the members we serve with special needs? That makes sense as a point of alignment, instead of trying to figure that out all on your own without collaborating with schools and with families in that case, of course. So those are a couple thoughts. The other is a lot of the clubs that have decided to really focus on academic skill building have picked a third-party resource like Renaissance Learning or Khan Academy or something like that. And so vetting that, having your staff try it out themselves before you roll it out is a good option. And also, one thing that you could use the education learning community for would be, if there's one you're considering, just to ask who else has tried this, what do you think about it? Since some of those programs, it seems like have been more successful in clubs than others. Thanks for those questions. I was originally thinking that we could spend some time just focused on whatever pieces of youth-centered learning you all want to dive into a little deeper. Since we have a small group here, we could still do breakout rooms, which might be quite small, or we could just sort of stay together as a whole group and see if there's a piece of this conversation that you're looking for more advice in. We can kind of use this group as a troubleshooting team. So if these are kind of the categories, we can also just talk about overall youth-centered learning. Anything you want to dive into, anything you want to share with this group, or that you want to ask advice of your colleagues?
Well, I know going forward, pretty much everybody, I don't know if everybody is either in their own location or school base. But for school partnership, are there any other methods that you would say are been very beneficial to with communicating and communicating the goals, not just from the teachers, but just from the overall goal?
Yeah, definitely. Lots of ways I could answer that. One is that in the school partnerships planning guide, there's sort of a chart of different levels of engagement, from a more foundational school partnership to a more advancing school partnership to a really exemplary school partnership. Because, some school partnerships, it looks like we share a bus. There's a bus that drops kids off, and that's our current partnership. So that would be a more foundational partnership, all the way up to really deep engagement where club staff and teachers are planning together and they're participating in professional development together. So different levels of engagement. It's not a binary yes or no thing. When it comes to communicating shared goals, one of the tools that's available on that page is a school partnerships workshop. And the reason for that is a lot of people ask this question of like, let's say I identify who the key contacts are at the school, I get them to agree to a meeting, we're all in the same room, what do we do when we have everyone at the table? And so that workshop is designed to walk you through how you could look at some relevant youth data together. So looking at school data, looking at club data, looking at NYOI data, look at some data together and then develop some shared goals. Because one of the things that's kind of make or break for a strong partnership is whether you have shared goals. If the school's goals and the club's goals are totally separate, then the partnership might fall apart because it might feel irrelevant. And then after you have some shared goals, to identify what the roles are going to be, who's going to do what, how are you going to communicate, who's going to be connected at what level. So in terms of communicating shared goals, I would definitely recommend that workshop. In terms of communicating what your club does, 2 resources that I would recommend are the Youth Development Resource Catalog, which was really written to help clubs choose the programs they want to run. But the helpful thing about it is that for each program, it describes the academic and the social and emotional skills that young people build. And then it also has information like how many sessions are there, what age group was designed for, what kind of trainings and resources are there. But you could use those skills as a way to describe what your club does to schools in a more compelling way. I'll say before I worked for Boys and Girls Clubs, I was a teacher and I taught high school chemistry, and I knew that a lot of my students went to a Boys and Girls Club, and I purely thought that was like a fun thing that they did after school. I didn't know much about the programs. I didn't know much about the academic support that was available, the leadership opportunities that were available. And so one nice thing about this Youth Development Resource Catalog is you could use it to describe to a school what your club does in the language of skill building, specifically social and emotional skills, since that's a big value add. If you want to get even more in the weeds when it comes to describing and communicating what your club does, I would say the nerdier and more technical version of that is a document called Mapping Our Programs to National Standards, also available in the school partnerships section. And it's also on the Project Learn page. And it goes through for Boys and Girls Clubs of America programs and describes what young people learn in the language of the Common Core, the CASEL social and emotional standards, the Next Generation Science standards, and other relevant standards. So if you want to get really specific and say, these are the specific Common Core standards that young people are building in each of these programs, that's the document that's designed to do that.
Thank you.
Thank you. Anything else you all want to take this time to ask your colleagues or share about or reflect on?
Maybe I can ask the group as well as you, Christy. One of the things I'm thinking of, number 4, like responding to high yield learning activities based both on needs and interests of young people, is like education and technology seem to be increasingly intertwined. And I feel like club resources that we just are not able to keep, at least I feel like my club, Boys and Girls Clubs of Boston, it's really hard to keep, to provide the technology at the club level. It's often like all the technologies in the computer clubhouse, right? Versus like, it should be like really everywhere. Are other people encountering this? Is it something that clubs should try to figure out? Like, is BGCA trying to make a push to integrate education and technology for clubs?
Yeah, I'm happy to answer from a BGCA perspective, but first I'll see if anyone has any recommendations from the group about integrating technology in the club.
Well, a small bit of that with integrating some technology. We've done some work game-wise as well as with lessons using Kahoot and having the kids use their phones. I know that's already a slippery slope, but if you plan it right, you can get them to collaborate and also learn a lot with that. Also, digital arts. It's a couple of different sections in there. Also with myfuture.net, I just realized they have a couple different programs in there. Yes, they love Kahoot. As well as we got a blessing to get some Chromebooks for our kids. So even if they're not in the computer lab area, we can kind of like divvy them out. And that came through our Tech Rock grant that we had for our young girls, teaching them about STEM and STEAM. And that was another little outreach that we had with that. So for us, I would say using cell phones, the Chromebooks that we have, just upgrading to the best of our ability of what we can do with our computers. Because I'll tell you, I bug my tech partner, and he knows me by name. If we have any small issue, I'm trying to have him get on it. And that's just because if I had a problem trying to send some information, I want them to get there. I want it to be a clear road of connection. That's the same way. And then also, if you can email, I know what I've done before, even with my future, is have the kids make their little BGC email that we only use at BGC. And it's just, another little way of communication if I need to get them stuff, kind of like a Google Classroom.
Thanks for sharing all that. I'll add, when it comes to sort of integrating technology beyond the tech center, one piece of that is just having reliable broadband, reliable wireless internet. And unfortunately, when we think about the digital divide and the way that not every community has access to the internet, not every club has access to the internet, that's still a challenge. So we're always kind of going after partnerships and opportunities to make sure that more clubs can get connected. The other one, exactly to Willie's point, is a bring your own device policy, because particularly if you're serving young people who go to a one-to-one laptop to child school or tablet to child school, there are a lot of devices out there. And if you want to set up a policy to make sure that all those devices are used safely and the internet is used safely, Boys and Girls Clubs of America has a bring your own device policy template that you can kind of Swiss cheese, fill in the parts that are relevant to your specific club, since club safety and child safety is a really important part of technology. And then finally, I would say the way that my future is kind of continuously evolving is that it's more and more so being designed to not just be for the tech center. The first 3 programs on my future, digital literacy, media making, and computer science, were really designed sort of for the context of if you were all in a computer lab, but more and more, those programs and others are becoming activities that can kind of exist throughout the club day. And the tech piece is a small piece of it, but it's kind of woven in instead of being just a club tech kind of program. We're nearing the top of the hour, and so I want to share a few takeaways for things that you could do to follow up. These are all links that I mentioned, so now they're here on one page. One is that if you would like to have a one-on-one conversation with a youth development staff member who can talk with you about academic success, back to school, youth-centered learning, projects learned, school partnerships, anything else, the easiest way to do that is to book a consultation on programbasicsplanner.com/back. You pick the date and time, and your meeting will be scheduled. The second is that if you want to be part of a network of other professionals who are focused on education, this is a group that you can send out any questions to, ask for advice. You're also kind of the first to hear about new resources and opportunities. That's how you can join. I mentioned this education learning pathway earlier, but I want to highlight this one more time. There are so many trainings out there. And so if you're wondering what are the trainings that I should recommend for my education staff, for youth development professionals, for anyone that's involved in homework help or tutoring, for anyone that's connected to education in the club, the place I would send you is this education learning pathway, and that'll show you the trainings that are on SLU as well as some recorded webinars. But I tried to highlight the ones that are available virtually so you don't have to wait for an all staff or wait for an in-person training. Finally, that link at the bottom is kind of just a 2-pager for academic success. It does include all of the programs that are in academic success and the complementary resources on my future. And it has the contact information for the whole education team. So if you want to reach out to me or any of my colleagues, You can see our contact information there. Thank you all so much for joining. I appreciate you taking the time in a very busy season to talk about youth-centered learning. Very glad that you were able to come. And I hope you have a great afternoon. So I'll stick around if anyone has any other questions, but really appreciate your time and thanks for being here.
Thank you.